everyone having to adjust to where and how we work with remote working. And of course, now some people are going back in as return to office mandates kick in. I think we're also living in a time where there's just heightened levels of anxiety, a lot of disruption, think Gen AI, and I think fear. We're living in this climate where a lot of people are feeling more anxious, more insecure, and there's just a lot of uncertainties ahead. So that triggers up the fear factor, and we need courage in order not to be paralyzed by that fear. And so often there's a gap between what it is we can do and what we're capable of doing and what we actually do. And so this book is about helping people close that courage gap, because fear often keeps us from taking the most constructive actions that we can take for ourselves in all aspects of our lives.
Well, I'm going to have to talk to you outside of this show about Kilimanjaro, because my teenage boys and I are doing that next year. So we just committed ourselves to that a couple of weeks ago. So, but I think you're absolutely right. I was just in Davos this past weekend and this past week, and one of the things that I noticed was that courage to face the massive changes we're dealing with in society, and that we're going to see in the next few years, and the total disruption of work and the way we do it and the way we think about it, and really actually maybe in the way that we live and exist. I mean, I think we're in this seminal moment in history, and I don't see a lot of courage in having the discussions that we need to have about that. How do we find that courage? How do we bridge that gap and have the conversations? Let's break it down to the workplace. How do we as leaders start to have that conversation in our own organizations?
Yeah, no, well, I think there's this deficit of courage, which you point to, is real. And what we often don't fully appreciate is the hidden delayed tax that exacts when we're not having these conversations. In terms of leaders in organizations, I mean, leaders need to be leading the way. That's their role. They are in leadership roles, which is both a privilege and a responsibility. But I think as people do a risk-reward assessment, and let's face it, we're humans. We're always doing risk-reward assessments, Brett. We're always going, should I or shouldn't I? And often they happen in a blink, a microsecond. Do I speak up? Do I challenge? Do I have this? And the cognitive calculus, our brains are wired for safety, for preserving the status quo, and for not putting our sense of status at risk. And so we often hold back when we need to step up or speak up, and lean in and have those sometimes difficult conversations, take those risks. But I think a key way to do it, and I wrote this book, and I was very intentional in writing a pretty short book that really synthesized the research with the key principles, but also that was very actionable. And the first chapter of the book helps people identify what is it that is so important for you that you will be willing to risk what you're afraid of, because it's such a worthy pursuit. It's such an important value. And so I do think we need to be really anchored to the values that we want to define ourselves by. We have to connect with what gives us a sense of integrity, which often will then compel us to do the things that honestly, that little fearful voice in our head would be urging us not to do.
I think that's spot on. What are some examples from the book where courage led to sort of transformational change? Because I think the more examples we can give people of, that it can really work out when you have courage. Can you share some stories? I mean, there must have been some stories from your book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I start with, in the book is a story of me growing up. I grew up in rural Australia, on a dairy farm, big sister of 7 kids. And, as a kid, I was desperate to have a horse. My dad didn't have much money, so we ended up winning a horse in a raffle. And I remember this was a pretty wild horse, but every day I would go out before school, go out again after school. And day after day after day, I got more and more confident, less and less anxious. And the key principle that I learned, internalized then, but I couldn't have articulated, was that our growth cannot coexist with our comfort levels. We have to be willing to trade comfort for growth, for learning new things, for becoming more competent in whatever it is we want to be more competent in, growing in different ways. And I've taken that with me through my adult life. I have lived around the world, Rhett, multiple countries, multiple continents, live now just outside Washington, D.C. But I have long really been very guided by a key principle for me, is that we're all here to use our gifts, whatever they may be, for good in the world, to be a force for good. And that often requires us to take risks, to put ourselves out there, to try things that we don't know we're going to succeed at. Several years back, I tried to launch an example of where I tried that and I didn't succeed. I tried to launch an online TV channel. This is about 10 or 11 years ago, called Raw Courage TV. And while the content was good, I did not know how to commercialize it. I lacked a lot of the knowledge, the know-how and skill to do that. And I look back on that, and it's easy to call things like that a failure, because I failed to get the outcome that I wanted. But I learned a lot along the way. I met some incredible people. And I think often we focus our energy more on what we don't want to happen and the failure we don't want to experience than on what we do want to have it happen. And we know from studies of the brain that our brains are 2 times as sensitive to what could go wrong versus what we want to make more right. And so we have to be really anchored to what it is that gives us a sense of purpose, and that aligns with the kind of person that we just want to be.
That's true. For you, what how do you recognize, because there's got to be a way for us to realize when we're living in fear, right? And we're making decisions in fear. Do you have a way, a method, and some tips for people from the book or from your experience that let people sort of stop the living in fear or acting in fear or making decisions in fear, and sort of recalibrate so that they can make a more courageous decision? Is there a way people can sort of catch that behavior and stop that behavior?
Well, I always just ask people, what is it that's not working great in your life? Like, identify what are the pain points. There's got to be a lever. If everything in your life is just awesome and you just in love with all aspects of your life and you feel immense positive energy around it, great. That's awesome. But start with that. Start with what's not working. Start with what's causing stress, or at least isn't making you feel super pumped up, powerful, purposeful. And I think that's a great place to start, because, the pain of staying where we are has to exceed the pain of the psychological discomfort of changing. So we've got to people have got to identify that.
Yeah. So, for leaders, I know leaders sometimes, when I work with a lot of CEOs in my practice, and the fear of failure is ever present, and they're reminded by their boards and their shareholders constantly. How do you, when you speak to CEOs or people leading, how do you balance the need for bold decision making versus that fear of failure?
Well, I mean, it's always going to be there, right? It's just recognizing courage is in the absence of fear. It's 2 things. One is managing fear levels, because sometimes our fear is disproportionate to the risk. And secondly, it's being willing to act in the presence of it, because there's something more important at stake. And I too work with a lot of senior executives. I've just left a role as senior partner in board and CEO succession at Korn Ferry. And I've worked with a lot of people stepping into CEO and C-suite roles in some of the world's biggest companies. And, they are incredibly smart, incredibly results driven, very accomplished, good at what they do. There's no doubt that they have the ability to do extraordinary things. But it's interesting. They rise to those positions because of what they do, because they're so good at what they do. But often they cap themselves because they haven't done the inner work to really shine the light on what is it that makes them feel vulnerable and insecure. And until we're clear about what makes us feel vulnerable, our decisions are going to be guided and governed by avoiding that. So I think there's some deep work as a coach. We need to, it's not just talking strategy. It's about getting deep into the identity of who is it you want to be? What gets in the way of that? What is it that you're most afraid of? And then, the 5 why question, why is that? And what would happen if that happened? And what would happen if that happened? But just trying to peel back all the layers of fear that often are sitting there in the driver's seat in ways we don't even know. And ways that shows up can be posturing. It can be being hyper controlling. It can be micromanaging. It can be perfectionist standards, which I see something that impacts women even more so than men.
Right.
It can be just, intellectualizing our emotions, having to talk about everything, but people who just don't feel it, you're not connecting at that authentic emotional level. So it can show up and represent in many ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I often find that people, at the core of it, people often don't know exactly what they want in the big picture of things, right? And when you don't know exactly, when you don't have clarity on that, what it is you actually want in life and what you want it to look like, I think it's very easy to act in fear and operate in fear. What role does vulnerability and authenticity play in courageous leadership for you?
Oh, it has a massive role, Rhett, because Brene Brown once said that vulnerability is the ultimate measure of courage. I agree with that in general, but I think there's more to it than pure vulnerability. If you think about the level of uncertainty that people face, all of the unknowns, sometimes, it is about making a decision to step into the unknowns and doing something despite all of the different risks. And we know we're vulnerable. We're clear about our vulnerability, but we need to do it anyway. But that authentic piece to it, you think about the most inspiring leaders, they're real people. You know who they are as a human, not just as the hat that they wear or the title that they wear. And being authentic means lowering the masks that we wear to protect ourselves. It means showing up. I don't say it means bringing your whole self to work, because you know what? Sometimes your whole self isn't. We don't want to see some parts of your whole self. But it means about showing up in a way that people can grab hold of who you are and they're not left wondering, who are they really? And we all know people, and we've all experienced people who have a really polished veneer. And it's a very practiced authenticity. They share with you how they were struggling yesterday. But you get that even that doesn't feel wholly real. Like, what else is going on that they're not sharing? And so I think it takes a lot of our own work to really be okay with our own vulnerability, to be able to be truly who we are without feeling like we need to prove or please or protect or impress. Because anytime we're trying to do that, honestly, that's getting in the way of us just being who we are. And it's something that I wrote about in the book is, don't try, just be. Like, how would you show up if you weren't trying to be someone and you were just being who you are?
Yeah, that's interesting. We don't have a lot of practice of just being who we are, do we?
No, we don't. And often from an early age, we're conditioned to feel pressure that we have to be
God,
someone else other than who we are, right?
I just you said that and it struck me, but I'm not sure that sometimes we know how to be who we are. I don't know. That's an interesting. That's something I'm gonna have to think about a good bit. Are there any
Well,
thoughts
well,
on?
you know
Uh,
what? Here's what I think. And I know there's exercises I've done many times with clients or when I'm doing a group program. I'll take people back. I'll just get them to step back into the shoes of them before they thought they had to be someone else. Who were you before you thought you had to be smarter or more beautiful or stronger or fill in the blank? Like, who were you before you felt that there was something about you that was lacking? And sometimes, people go, gosh, that would have been when I was literally born, before I started getting those messages early. But I don't think it's impossible to connect with that self. I do think we have to practice it. I think we have to, and I know myself, just before I get up on stage to speak, I do a lot of keynote speaking, and I have things I'm really passionate about saying. It's why I've written this book, that The Courage Gap. And before I get up on stage to speak, I just say a little prayer. I'm like, I'm here to serve, not to prove. And I shared in the book how, as I was writing it, that, a few times I felt a little anxious because I felt like I had to prove how smart I was,
Right.
and had to say something that was so astoundingly extraordinary. No one had ever heard that before.
Right.
And the
Blows
reality
people's
is,
minds, right?
none of us
Yeah.
are saying something that no one's heard before. We're saying it, with our own unique lens. And what helped me write the book with as much authenticity as I could summon was just committing to write a book that would help people, that would be of service, and not writing to impress. And yeah, do I want to make sure it's evidence-backed? Sure. Do I want to make sure it's, it doesn't have typos and it's well written? Absolutely, because I want it to be a readable book that can stand on its own. But I'm not writing this book to try and show everyone how much research I have or how many big words I know. And let's face it, people can see through that. I'm sure, Rhett, you've met people. You can tell when they're trying to prove and impress. And actually, it doesn't make you impressed by them. We're more impressed with the people who aren't trying to prove how impressive they are.
Yeah, you can put a big old exclamation point on that. And I think that actually sure shows true courage, what you're talking about there, right?
Yeah.
Not to try to be the smartest person in the room, not trying to be. So yeah, that's pretty profound. Thank you for that. That's a great takeaway. So what are the other? It's very hard to break through as an author. I know that firsthand. And what do you think for you are the three biggest takeaways from this book, and what are people really going to learn?
Look, I think that the biggest takeaway from this book that I hope people will understand is that everyone, from the most timid and cautious and risk averse to people who have felt so burned by life that they've retreated, everyone has the capacity, the ability to be braver than they have until now, to do things that they've been putting off and avoiding and rationalizing themselves out of, that everyone has that capacity. The second thing I would want people to be clear about is that they're likely underestimating or discounting how much it's costing them by avoiding doing the uncomfortable things. That actually over time it's cumulative. And while we think it might be stressful or incredibly uncomfortable, and we'll feel so vulnerable to share with someone what's really going on for us, it actually is far less uncomfortable over time than not doing it, because it cuts us off from so much of life, and things that aren't good now don't get better with time. They just get worse. So that would be the second thing. And the third thing, if I really distill it all down, would be the importance of just embracing your own humanity and embracing your fallibility, and the fact that you are a unfinished draft of who you want to become. And because all of us get it wrong, all of us wimp out, all of us fall short of being who we want to be. But actually, when we can make peace with that with our unfinished selves, it actually frees us to try more things and to pick ourselves up faster.
Yeah, I've learned that. I've coached a lot of professional athletes, and they talk about having to really be able to do that quickly and put it out of it when they fail, to put that out of their mind, because the next play is in, right now. And it I thought that was going to be the last question, but you said something that I want to ask you one more question about, and that is courage, can it become a habit? Can you build a habit here? Can you build a muscle that helps you really become more courageous in your life?
Yes, yeah, you bet. I think it, you know, we learn to bake by baking, and we learn to play guitar, sing by singing. Well, we learn to courage
Right.
by couraging. And I think it's like a muscle. Think of it like a muscle, Rhett. If you haven't been to the gym for 20 years, then you're going to go and you're going to lift 5 pounds and you're going to be very sore
Oof.
tomorrow. But if every day you
Yeah.
go to the gym and you spend just 10 minutes lifting some weights, doing some sit-ups, doing some squats, 3 weeks from now, it won't be as hard. Well, it's the same for doing the things that are uncomfortable. Every time we act in the presence of our fear, every time we defy a doubt or do something, even though we're feeling, nervous about it, we reclaim the power that fear has had over us, and we grow our own. We start to build that as a muscle. And that's what habit's about. It's that muscle memory, and it becomes over time. It would become our default. It takes time. You don't just create a new habit like that. And so that's what I really want to leave people with by reading the book, that this isn't a one and done. This is something you have to practice throughout your life. But when you commit to it, you expand your life exponentially.
About that. I think that's a great ending right there. Um, where can people get the book, The Courage Gap?
Thank you. Well, they can get it wherever good books are sold. It is on Amazon, comes out today. But you can also head over to my website, margiewarrell.com/The Courage Gap, and learn more there. And there's links to retailers of all sorts, including independent bookstores. So, yeah. And I also narrated it for those who like to listen to books. Assuming you can understand my accent, then you can listen to me narrating it via Audible.
That's awesome. And if they want to have you to speak or coach, or I'm sure that information is
Oh,
there
yeah.
too.
Well, all on my website. Yeah. And while my accent's probably going to make it hard for people to understand, it's margiewarrell.com. And yeah, lots of information and videos about my speaking and coaching, facilitating is all there. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming on the show. This is Bestseller Live. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, Rhett.